Is grabbing sword blades really that contentious, and why do people have so many different frames of reference? Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatorist. I'm going to keep this a fairly brief one, but I've done a lot of videos over the years that talk about commanding, controlling, grabbing, disarming, half-swording, that involve grabbing your blade. And there's numerous different ways of doing this. And indeed, with certain types of sword, like long swords, even rapiers, we see sometimes the hand's put fully around the blade. And a lot of people question, why are you going to cut your hand? Well, there's ways to mitigate that. Obviously, gloves might play a part, but even without gloves, there's ways you can grip a blade such that it doesn't slide up and down. And also, there are some blades which are easier or harder to grip for numerous reasons, and that's what I'm going to talk about here. So if you look at, for example, Langmesser sources, we will see that indeed, obviously, you can grip the back of a Langmesser because it has a spine on it. So I'm not in contact with the edge here. So I could half sword with this. And in fact, we see half-swording with Langmessers done in this way, without any risk. This is a sharp blade, incidentally, without any risk to your hand, really, or very minimal risk to your hand. And there are certain scenarios where it might be advantageous to do that. So we see it with Langmesser. We also see it with, for example, longswords. We see grabbing and gripping of blades done with your own sword and also the other person's with longswords. Now, longswords are a little bit different to this in that they do have two edges, but bear in mind they're usually narrower, and in terms of the edge bevel, so this is a very thin blade, so the edge bevel is very acute, whereas with longswords, because they're double-edged and have a spine in the middle and tend to be thicker, they have a more obtuse edge. And that's not to say they're not sharp, but it's a different type of edge, and anybody will know that a razor blade is very, very thin. If you make the material of the razor blade wider, or take something like a chisel, for example, or a typical sort of like a bushcraft knife, it can still be very sharp on the very edge, but you're dealing with different edge geometry. Now, when we get into something like rapiers, for example, we actually have a blade that's really quite thick at the centre, but very, very narrow, which actually means you end up with even more, usually, depending on the rapier, even more obtuse edges. That's not always the case, and we recently looked at this lovely new rapier. I will be reviewing this soon. There are rapiers and there are rapiers, and clearly the blade on this is not that dissimilar to certain side swords and arming swords. So absolutely, a sword can have thin, narrow and very sharp edges and still be what we would commonly call a rapier. So there's parameters. But then when we look at certain other styles, for example, if we look at small sword, we've got no big problem there, because grabbing a small sword blade is just not really a problem, because they're usually triangular and they're pretty narrow. It's like even more exaggerated from the rapier. But there are certain swords that we relatively rarely see grabbed. One of those is sabers, and another one that comes up quite a lot in the comments section is katanas or wakisashis, so Japanese swords. And if we look at classical Japanese techniques from kenjutsu and other forms of budo, such as, well, kendo drills as well, but kenjutsu, iaido, and so on and so forth. The fact is that you don't see an awful lot of grabbing of the blade. The exception is when you place a hand against the blade in order to steer it like this, sometimes to block in various different ways, sometimes to half sword and thrust into armour for armoured fighting techniques and things like this. This sword's from Jaiku, incidentally. Very nice it is too. And so we don't see grabbing of the blade an awful lot in Japanese swordsmanship. So the question is why? And I think there's a few things at play. One of them here is that Japanese swords are set up to be really sharp. Now that might sound like a little bit of pandering to the mythology of swords here, but the simple fact is that yeah, they are kept really, really sharp, and they do keep a really, really keen edge. So we do have a sharper edge to worry about. So if you're grabbing someone else's sword, for example, if you look at kenjutsu techniques, they tend to grab the person's hilt, grab the person's hand or arm or things like this. But I think there's another factor that often gets overlooked, and that's a question of how quick is it to, against someone grabbing or grappling your blade, to essentially do something, move it, you know, pull it away, draw cut, whatever. Now, katanas, as I've mentioned in many, many videos, are relatively short compared to not just European swords, but even compared to, for example, Indian swords. Here's a one-handed Indian sword, and you'll see that the blade is pretty much the same length, and this is a two-handed sword. This is actually longer than normal. This is a 29-inch blade. Most katanas, certainly from the 16th century onwards, tend to only have 26 to 28 inch blades. This is longer than normal. So therefore, it's quicker and easier if someone does try to grab or control your blade to essentially yank it out and draw it out. So you've got a sharp edge and you've got a relatively short blade. Now, we often talk about length being, or shortness being, a disadvantage, but in this situation it's an advantage. Now, people often ask me about sabres. They say, why isn't there more grabbing of sabres? Well, recently I showed the battlefield sabre techniques from Hutton, so he does do them. They do exist, and there are French treatises and Spanish treatises which have grabbing of your own blade and the opponent's blade, and sometimes even using a scabbard to block with. It's very cool stuff. So there is thinking out of the box, but the mainstream sabre material doesn't really have an awful lot, and when they do grab an opponent's sword, it's usually the hand, like with the sabre, so like with the katana. And I would say that's a very light weapon, and it's very quick to get out of the way of someone trying to grab it. Now, the problem is with this theory is, where does the Langmesser come into that? Because the Langmesser is also light and is also sharp and short, and it's easy to quickly get away from a grab. So why was this grabbed so much more than later sabres? And I can't say I fully have the answer. However, one thing I have noticed is there seems to be some correlation between grabbing of opponents' blades and longer blades, so rapier and longsword most famously. And quite simply, if a person has a long, let's just grab this rapier, if a person has a long blade, at the moment at which you've stopped it with a parry or intercepted it or whatever, at the moment of that, because it's a long blade, as George Silver points out in his manual, it takes quite a bit of time to get it moving again and recharge another blow or pull it away or whatever. So actually a long blade, once it's stopped and grabbed, you have more time to grab it, there's more of it to grab, and it's more difficult for the other person to get it away from your grab. So with a long sword or a rapier, I would argue, and to some extent a small sword as well, I think they are easier to grab. But as I say, this theory comes back to, well, why is there so much grabbing and commanding done in the Langmesser? The only thing I can think is, to a certain extent, most of that is done on the person's body and hand and hilt and stuff like this. So in fact, that's partly closeness, because these weapons are so close that if someone cuts at me and I cover here, I can grab their hand, because their hand is just there, because they're very short, big knives, as they're called, Langmesser. So they're fairly close to me to be able to do it, disengage, and do my own attack back. But then we come back to, why don't we see more of that in Japanese swordsmanship? And we do see some use of the hilt coming in to even lock and bind in the same way we do with some longsword techniques in Fury, for example. But I think there's a lot to unpack there. So what are your thoughts? Why do you think? Is it just to do with sharpness? Is it to do with blade length, blade balance, quickness, balance? What do you think are the main reasons why in some systems, for example rapier and longsword, we see a lot more grabbing of the opponent's weapon, and in some systems, for example Kenjutsu or sabre, we see a lot less of grabbing of people's blades? Ideas on a postcard, or rather in the comments down below. I hope this has been thought-provoking. I never promise to have all the answers, but I can certainly provide some questions and some possible answers for us to discuss down below. Anyway, cheers for watching, and I hope to see you back on the channel soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.